Okay.
Wonderful. Now I have to set it up. There we go. Now that you're recording. So anyway, again, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate you taking time out of your busy day. It's never easy. However, we all know that continuing education is important, as well as particular topics that maybe you aren't fully informed on or just would like to expand upon. So this one today is safeguarding your practice from theft, fraud, and adulteration. I know this is not like one of the most fun topics. It's kind of probably a bit heavy, but I think it's an important one, especially when we're so busy and we have so many systems and so many individuals to manage. It's easy to kind of quote unquote, let your guard down or find yourself in a compromised situation. So I want to first say, let me clear the air. I think it's really, really important. This is not, so as we talk through this topic today, it's going to feel to some like, all of these tips and best practices, can't I just trust my employees? Like it feels like maybe the message is that you can't trust employees. And I just want to say that that is absolutely not true. I do believe in creating a culture of trust, and I'm not making any recommendations or endorsements for acting or treating employees like they are criminals, because the reality is most of our employees are honest. Unfortunately, it's not every employee that's honest. And as I tell a couple of stories, you'll come to see that those very, very few dishonest employees can make a really big impact on your clinic. And I don't mean in a good way. So what I'm recommending is not to create an opportunity of risk, to have preventative measures in place and protect your business so that you can best serve your community effectively and affordably. Because the business owners aren't the only ones affected when it comes to theft, fraud, and or adulteration. When you're losing product, when you're losing time, all of those things equate to money. And when we need to make up money, who really pays the price for that? And so we really want to continue to be able to provide the best medicine at a reasonable price to the best of our ability. So that's why I think that this is important. So some quick facts. I will tell you, I always encourage this. Whenever possible, use a lifeline. There's a lot of material out there, and this particular presentation is not about data, but I thought it's important to have some statistics in there. So Melissa, thank you for sharing from one of your recent publications, some of the research information that you had found. And so a couple of quick facts here. 95% of US businesses experience employee theft. And each year that results in about $50 billion. About 43% of inventory losses are attributed to employees, which we'll talk about that because that doesn't necessarily mean theft. That can also mean like shrink. So for those of you who don't know what shrink isn't necessarily theft, it's loss in general. So losses can occur in a variety of ways, from expired product to waste, to misstored and you can't find it, to stolen. So shrink represents about 1.62% of the bottom line. So take your overall profitability and multiply that times 1.62%, and that's how much dollars that's talking about. And the average time fraud occurs before becoming detected is 2 years. And over 26,000 employees were apprehended for stealing in 2020. And then, another way that, fraud and theft and adulteration occurs is, of course, in data as well. So 60% of data breaches happen because of insider threats. And Melissa, I took one of your quote, what you specifically said in your publication, which I thought was really a great way to phrase this. That veterinary hospitals, because we're medical professionals and we like to believe because we're medical professionals, we hire the very best. the most ethical, the most honest, the greatest integrity. But veterinary hospitals are no exception when it comes to employee theft. In fact, due to our family-like environments, we're more likely to experience theft in our hospitals because we trust everyone and do not always have safeguards in place. And I thought that was like brilliantly written and right on the nose. The other piece that I didn't include kind of in this slide, so you'll notice that my slides have pretty much everything we're going to talk about today, so that as people download them and have them to reference, you don't have to take notes. So that's the point I'm getting at with this is you don't have to take notes today. When you download the slides, you're going to have every single thing we talked about. But what is also very interesting is we're in a period of recession, and we know that this is the time where some individuals are falling on harder times. And when faced with financial constraints, sometimes people make decisions or actions that they wouldn't necessarily make under any other circumstances. So I think that that's important to keep in mind. All right, so we all have horror stories. So before I get started on a few horror stories, throw in the chat. That doesn't show up on the recording, but if you'll throw in on the chat, how many of you have been a victim of some type of employee theft, fraud, or adulteration? So some of you are already jumping. Yeah, so you'll start to see as we go along. And then some of you will even think about something and go, gosh, I didn't even think about that as an example. And so, yes, I've already fallen victim, or you may have heard of someone. So I'm going to give you a couple of horror stories that I've had and or that I've encountered to wrap your mind around why I think this topic is so important. And these tips are going to be something that I think that you will go back and reference and put quite a few of the best practices into place. So my very first management position, your drug reps are very benevolent and give us staff samples. And I can't say it was my management position. It was my inventory management role, particularly at this time. And what was interesting is that my inventory was going up, and I had not cut any POs or added to it. And so I did a little research, and there were staff members selling their Revolution Plus samples to the clinic at customer cost. Because what they were doing is they were going into the practice software and putting Revolution -6, which gave them a credit of 6 times the system pricing for that product, and they were putting it back on the shelf because they didn't need it. And I was floored. So something they got for free, they were making, upwards of $70, $80 off of. So I was really shocked to find that. So that was my first role. Then I moved into actual management, and unfortunately, the manager that was in the position before me was a sudden exit, so I had no one to train me. And the owner said, "You're a smart girl, you'll figure it out." And so the only way to kind of figure it out was just to run a bunch of reports and take home all of the deposit slips and really try to piece together the business and get an understanding of where we're at. And well, during that time period, there were a few odd things. So there was 2 events that happened. So this will go with stealing from the deposit. But what had happened was in the midst of all this, the day-to-day stuff had to be done. And I went to get the deposit out of the safe to take it to the bank, and the money poured out everywhere. And I said, "Oh, front desk, can you please just seal the envelope?" And they were like, "Oh, we weren't allowed to do that prior. We were never allowed to seal the deposit envelope because the practice manager needed to, count it every night or every morning the next day when she came in. And I thought, okay, I mean, that's odd, but, sure, whatever. So as I'm looking at, remember, I have all these reports and all these deposit envelopes and slips because I'm just trying to piece together the business. I noticed a lot of them had whiteout on the cash portion of it. And then when I looked through the inside of the envelope, I could see that the cash amount had been changed. I thought, this seems to be happening like 3, 4, 5 times a week. And that's a lot. And had been months and months, like the entire year worth of files that I'd taken home. And then I did an audit report and I saw that actually payments had been removed or changed in the practice software. So the amount that it was changed in the practice software equaled the amount that was written originally on the envelope before whiteout was applied. So then I started tracking the employees' initials associated with it, but there was a hiccup with that. There were a handful that weren't even the employee who worked that day. Like the employee was off and it was their initials being used on these transactions. So I thought that was odd. And so this just kind of spiraled, and it turned out that, embezzlement was occurring. About $60,000 worth of money was stolen over a 3-year period. And the interesting thing is I couldn't even go back prior to 3 years, and it likely been happening for longer because there was a PIMS system transition 3 years prior. So who knows with the old system. So alongside that, I noticed that one of our employees was on the health insurance because I have to reconcile and pay bills, but had nothing deducted from their paycheck. And I thought, well, that's odd. And so I told the employee, hey, this must have been a mistake. I don't know how this got overlooked, but we're going to have to, get that set up on payroll deductions. And the employee was like, no. Like, disenroll me, like, take me out. And I said, that's not the way this works. And she was so upset because she had been put on the insurance so that the company could have group benefit rates, but none of the employees, it turns out, none of them were paying their own premiums. They were all coming out of the company's money. So because the manager at the time had also had medical issues and needed the company healthcare, the discounted company healthcare, and the better healthcare. So that was the problem-solving way around that. And so, like I said, sometimes desperate times lead people to doing things that they maybe wouldn't normally do. And so these are a couple of stories that I've encountered, but as some of you who do know me, you know that I used to do management services consulting and management services with my employer. And so I would go visit other hospitals as well and do, various management consulting from financials to practice management to even in some cases recruiting. This particular hospital I was visiting. I was just visiting and seeing how their hospital worked. And it was closer to the end of day. And the receptionist said to this particular practice manager, hey, do you mind if I leave early? I need to leave about 30 minutes early to pick up my child. And it was a rainy day and it was slow. And the manager said, no problem, I'll cover the front desk. There's no last appointment of the day anyway, so it might just be pickups or returns. And asked me if I minded that we kind of hang out towards the front and carry on our conversations about their business. And so as I was up there, a gentleman came in with a bag of dog food and said, Fido just won't eat it. When I bought the food, you all said if it didn't work out, I could return it. And manager said, no problem. Well, the manager went to return the food on the client's account, and the food had already been returned 2 days prior. Well, so I know we've all done this. It's like, oh, that's Mr. Jim's coming in, and it's not, it's Mr. Joe, and you just got them mixed up. So in his mind, he just thought, oh, crud, she pulled up the wrong client's account and credited the wrong client for the food. I'll just take the food back and we'll go ahead and do the credit on this client's account, and I'll figure out who the mistake was on later, after the client's gone. We're not going to hold the client up for this. But he did say to the client, did you return a bag of food 2 days ago? And the gentleman said, no, this is the only bag, and I'm returning it today. So just to make sure there wasn't some other bag somewhere or some issue. And so no problem, client goes. And so long story short, the manager did a little research, and it turns out that the only way he could figure out who the transaction belonged to, the original one, and get it corrected, was it was put back on a credit card. And some of you may not know that many of your PIM system, if not all of them, it actually does store the last 4 credit card numbers, even if it's not on the accounting history or invoicing history. Somewhere in the back side of the system, the last 4 of the credit card is stored somewhere, or your credit card terminal sometimes. So it doesn't store the whole number, or it encrypts it, but you can at least trace sometimes the last 4 digits. And so we did a cross-reference, and lo and behold, it pulled up the employee's credit card number because he traced it back to that employee's account. And so it turned out, after doing more research, the employee had been returning product from various clients and crediting it to her credit card. And then she used that same credit card to pay her vet bills. So that's how it was traced. And then the last one, just a major story, again, just to get you wrapped around the context, was clocking in. So another one that I was working with, we actually weren't working anything on time clock training or anything along those lines, but it ended up being a coaching, a research coaching and disciplinary opportunity working with this hospital, because we ended up on a sidebar of, hey, I think my employee is stealing time from me, padding their time clock. And so I helped them with the navigation and investigation. And sure enough, the individual was padding the clock in a couple of ways. So the first one is the geofencing, because this person works kennel, so they take the dogs to walk out in the yard. So the geofencing for clocking in and out from their phone app was pretty wide to cover the yard. So the employee figured out that as long as they are passing by the clinic, they could clock in or out. So the employee would clock in on the way to Starbucks and grab the coffee and come on into work on days that they were the only individual, because, we're closed on weekends, and was padding the clock. And surveillance cameras showed that the employee actually arrived at a different time. And then sometimes the employee clocked out at a particular time for this weekend shift, but the time was different. And that was because the employee the next morning was coming in and altering the time that they were there the day before. So adding some extra time to their time clock. So as I tell you these stories, you see they could really happen to anyone, and that's not even the end. There are so many more instances where I've seen even some of the most subtle but signs of theft and fraud in clinics, as well as heard them. And I'm sure if you ask a few of your peers, you'll hear some of their horror stories as well. And we could probably go on for days. So we'll get started with, how do you set yourself up from a preventative standpoint? All right. Oh, there we go. All right. So the first one, time clock fraud. We'll talk a little bit about that. This one, I'm not giving you a definition. I think we all know what time clock fraud means. So some common tips. Oops, let me go back. There we go. So some common tips is to ensure your practice management software is synced with the server so that the time clock cannot be altered But that also helps with fraud associated with things like payments and invoices, because time of day is really, really important. Limiting authorization to time clock adjustments. Who really needs access to adjusting the time and under what circumstances? And make sure those policies are in place. Everyone in your clinic should have a password protected time clock because, as you can see under the 5 most common, buddy punching is one of the most common forms of time clock fraud. Geofencing. So I gave you all an example. Most of your mobile time clock programs now have better geofencing. It doesn't necessarily have to be a rectangle or a radius anymore. A lot of them actually can allow you to dot map, and you can do specific areas like yards, say walking yards or daycare yards or things like that versus the parking lot or the street, right? So that you can make sure that time clock punches aren't occurring outside the clinic, and they're included with appropriate perimeters. Another most common one, so again, there's no really big tips on this other than awareness and keeping an eye on interesting behaviors, but overextending breaks. We're talking about those paid breaks by law that most states have. Personal internet usage or personal activities on the clock. And then distribution and travel, and that's one that I have actually seen most commonly come up, where professionals have padded their travel time or travel arrangements. So keeping an eye on that. Benefits and pay. So this is another area where we see some fraud and adulteration, and we've talked about one of those horror stories, but let's talk about some of the tips here. Auditing your payroll to make sure that employee benefits are indeed being deducted from the employee's paychecks and deducted correctly. This has nothing to do with fraud, adulteration, or theft, but just another quick tip. Also making sure that as premiums change, that you've updated those correctly in the system. So that's good for that as well. Asking your bank to include images of the cleared checks with each bank statement, because, well, we've heard of clinics with missing checks before, and where did they go? My sister worked for a company where someone happened to be an employee in the accounting department of their business, had worked with an accomplice and opened up a bank account similar to the business's name, where the bank teller didn't even notice it was a different company name and was diverting checks. So that was really interesting. Reconciling and counting cash upon opening, midday, and closing. This is a good practice, because if I am going to be responsible as a front desk or any cash handling employee, I want to know what was given to me that morning, how much exactly it is, because if it's short upon opening, I don't want to be responsible for that. And we want to get to the bottom of it because, that's my name on it ultimately. And then midday, as a best practice, not only is it good just to make sure that you're on track and that the staff are not there late in the evening finding and fixing mistakes, reconciling midday. And then as well at closing. And then all checks and cash being double checked and signed off by another employee for accuracy, as well as the drawer. And then, of course, making sure that those are all stored in a safe. Petty cash, cash drawer, and deposits when the business is not open. Documenting all workplace injuries and near misses, because, there's workplace work comp fraud that occurs as well. Document all performance and behavior counseling, and save any footage associated with injury or behavioral issues. And one that might be on a tip later on, but just in case it's not, minimizing how many employees' hands go in the cash jar. I don't think it's a good idea for all the employees to be, traipsing in and out behind the front desk, putting money in and taking money out of drawers. That's too many opportunities for things to go awry. And when cash is missing or incorrect, it is harder to figure out where it went and why it's missing and who's responsible. All right, so theft of goods and services. So again, remember, going back from the statistics, this is one of the highest area of losses in a business, and that results in a huge impact to the bottom line. Embezzlers of large amounts of money, like, felony level and higher, those are large dollar amounts, less frequent instances, but those can really add up. But a lot of them are smaller monetary amounts, like, $20 here, $10 there, $5 there, 75, they can accumulate. But again, if you have best practices for cash handling, you're minimizing the amount or frequency that they can do that, if at all. But let's talk about goods and services, because that's a huge category. All right. Auditing vendors and retailers to ensure that there's no shipping addresses other than your clinic. You would think that that doesn't happen, but it does, and it has. Again, ensuring those staff samples aren't being sold back to the clinic, which we'll talk a little bit about another safeguard on how to prevent that. Running account adjustments and discount reports to review any adjustments that have been made to accounts. So in all practice software, there is some type of audit trail, product or service price change reports. There are all sorts of various reports. And for me, as a practice manager, I would come in the very first kind of start of my day, other than getting organized and laying out a roadmap and handling any priorities, was just to do a quick, I spend about 10 minutes and I just quickly run a review for the day prior and just make sure everything's on the up and up and that there's nothing just jumping out at me. I don't get neurotic about it, but I do regular reviews. Regular inventory cycle counts, and along with that, reviewing for any unexplained adjustments. Ensuring that your purchase orders have been provided and they match the invoices that have come in, as well as reconcile to the statement that's being processed for payment. Because the other part about that too is, remember, there are a lot of promos that happen when ordering. It's like, buy 3 of this, get 1 free. Well, wouldn't you like to know that free one made it into the inventory system and didn't make it home with someone? Auditing client discount codes to ensure that they're on authorized customers, because first of all, no one's perfect. There's been times where I've had an employee who was separated and the discount code didn't get removed from their account, and I've forgotten to check for it. And so then they've come in after that and gotten services discounted unintentionally. They weren't trying, they didn't even know. Well, they knew when they paid the bill, but they didn't know it was going to happen when they came in. But here's what's interesting is I called Avamart Covetrus one time and I said, hey, is there a report you can create that you can tell me all clients' account numbers that have this code, this code, this code, and this code, right? Anyone that was a discount type code. There were clients that no one is familiar with that was getting special, like, friends and family discounts, and no one's ever even heard of them, or professional, so meaning like a doctor or some other medical professional. Sometimes we do courtesy discounts for those. There were all sorts of clients receiving discounts that they weren't authorized to be receiving. And so I was able to fix those because that's giving away money. Limiting write-offs of accounts receivable. So I don't let employees just write off balances on accounts. I mean, unless it's, sometimes it's like a quarter or 5 cent, 10 cent, things like that. Are we really going to go after a client for coinage? No, let's be real. But if it's a client that's coming back regularly, we might leave that balance on their account because it'll just get picked up in the next invoice. But if it's a client who doesn't come very often or hasn't been in a while, fine. But I don't allow write-offs other than that. And I have measures in place for that. Securing controlled drugs in the lockbox because, well, that's the law, but surveillance. And I think that this is becoming more of a regulatory standard or requirement now, but also to think about some of your high value drugs, same thing might apply. Storing inventory in an area with high visibility, security, and no immediate exit access. Storing fragile inventory at lower, easy to reach levels with appropriate spacing so that inventory doesn't get accidentally knocked off or dropped because, expensive drugs or fragile drugs, breaking those, that costs money. Checking for unusual amounts and frequencies of dietary returns. And, for me, it's not a practice that I do in the clinics that I've worked at. When food is returned, we know which vendors are going to come pick it up and which ones aren't. Returns are not a free-for-all. Not until I've validated and verified that we've gotten credit for them, then I will offer them out if they're suitable to be offered out as, free to staff or as samples or to a client in need. Because again, how do you know someone's not returning something that never actually came into the building? And then avoiding large balance account carrying, because again, how many of you have been left with an employee who has been separated or just stopped coming to work and you've never been paid for those services and never been able to collect on them? Now, again, there are laws. So before your first default is, well, I'm just going to set it all up on payroll deduction, I'm going to say, look at your state laws on that. But set policies and procedures in place so that employees and clients can't carry large balances. Embezzlement. This one is a very to heart one, because when it happens, you just feel taken advantage and hurt, because this is really the most overt way to take advantage, right? Because sometimes when people take product or when they pad the time clock, in their mind, it's not that serious. It's not that big of a deal. But embezzlement, it's like straight to the gut, fully intentional, and it hurts. So embezzlement, for those of you who may not know what that means, that's the theft or misappropriation of funds that are placed in one's trust or that belong to one's employer. So the most common of that is cash theft, misuse of credit cards, and rebate theft or personal use of rebates. So some quick tips here. Review credit card statements and all associated receipts, and don't be afraid to ask questions. Someone who's highly trustworthy and is being honest shouldn't be offended by explaining a receipt that maybe doesn't have a lot of description or a large purchase, just to make sure that things are in the up and up. Auditing your bookkeeping software for and even your practice software for fictitious vendors and customers. Making it mandatory that cash paying clients get a receipt. Now, I'm not saying you have to print out, but either they get it electronically or tangibly, and post a notice indicating to clients as such. Checking to make sure that there's no payments that have been made or credited after business closing or after the end of day has been reported and turned in. So again, one of those best practices in the morning when I do a look back, I just again run the deposit slip for the day before and just make sure it still matches the one that's in the safe that I'm just re-reviewing before I take it to the bank. Limit access to price changing in the practice management system. Who needs access to that and for what reasons? Like really think about that before it's a free-for-all to make all sorts of changes and removal of items and services from a client or a patient's account. All right, let's move on here. Oh, here's another one. This again might come up in another slide, so I apologize if it's duplicated, but one to be important. For those of you who use Sidekick or whose PIM system has a training version, I would run a report and see if any invoices have been generated out of that system. Because again, we're talking about giving clients receipts for cash. We want to make sure it matches, like there is no, foul business there, that those are not occurring, that the training systems are actually being used for training and not being used for some fraudulent activity. Identity theft doesn't happen super commonly in our industry, but I think if you think about the words identity theft in general, and as we talk through a few of these tips, you'll go, oh, okay, yeah, I can see where that happens in the veterinary workplace. All right, so a few tips here, and that'll help you wrap your head around some ways that identity theft occurs. Making it a policy that you do not store credit card numbers. And for those of you who do recording, so you call record, I believe in most states, if not every state, you have to stop recording when someone is providing or repeating a credit card number back to a client, first of all, or a customer. And then second of all, writing it down. I mean, I know that happens sometimes, that you kind of have to write it down. Well, I guess there's no have to, but we're multitaskers. I get that. But having written credit card numbers creates an opportunity upon which it falls into the wrong hands or goes home with someone accidentally in their, pocket notepad or whatever. So I'm a little weary of that. But if you do, I used to have a unique thing that I used to do is I had a system. So if I had to jot down a credit card number of a client's to process, I had a formula upon which I wrote their numbers down in a different order, but I had a formula for remembering what that number was. So when I got to the front desk to key it in, I would key it in correctly. But if someone were to somehow find that or try to read through my scribbling out, they'd have a hard time because they don't know what my method was, so, but again, if you can avoid writing it down, that's the best practice. Again, running a report to cross-reference credit cards used on employee accounts to make sure that it's not been used on any other accounts in your system. I mean, if they want to pay other people's bills, with their own credit card, that's fine. But, just making sure spot checking those periodically. And you can just do kind of random, almost like, how random drug tests, you just randomly draw one and just double check it periodically. Limiting or eliminating para staff calling in scripts to pharmacies to ensure that they're not calling in unauthorized meds for their self or for others. So I would not have it free range that all technicians are able to do that. I would probably limit the individuals who are able to call those in. Ensuring that employees have their own individual practice software login, because I've been to practices where everyone has the same login. I'm like, ay. If if something were to go awry, how would you know who? Everybody's logging in and using the same credentials. I would not do that. Ensure your practice software is set with a timing feature to password lock after a reasonable time and idle, because we all walk away from our chairs periodically, and that leaves your workstation open for someone to perform activity under your credentials. And most of the time it's not fraudulent, but how many times have you gone to an employee just for a general mistake and it has nothing to do with fraudulent, just a mistake or an error, and they were like, that wasn't me? Well, did they walk away from their workstation and someone used it because it wasn't password locked? Requiring all personal and financial information changes, employee and customer, to be submitted in person via written and signed documentation. Oh, I put that word twice. I'll edit that. So I'm all about airing that I'm not perfect, because you just see I put double phrase in my slide, but not via email or text, because I have had a document submitted by a client authorizing someone to use their care credit, and then they disputed the charge. And I now require that, nope, I mean, if you're gonna provide written documentation, I also want to see you in person, and because I have surveillance that shows you came in, you provided this, and you signed off on it. Although I don't think that Care Credit cares regardless, only authorized user. But here's where the employee side of things is important, is I had an employee change their banking information via email. And so it was changed and updated, and their money went into the wrong account, and they were adamant they never submitted or requested a bank change. Ay. Could you imagine that? That's a fun one.
Yes, that's actually a fraud thing that's been going on, where managers of different businesses are receiving an email that is asking for a bank change for their payroll deposit, but that email is not coming from an actual employee. It's coming from some type of hacker or something that's trying to steal that. So that's actually, in fact, Leslie Boudreau, I believe, also got one of those emails requesting a change. So it's happened to a friend in our field. So it's something to really be really aware of.
Oh, gosh. And I mean, you think about it, we're seeing a lot more email hacking and duplication. So it looks like your email address, but it's really not, or your name, and it's really not. If you think about it, pretty much these days, any professional you can find, if you have their name, you can find out the business they work for and their email address, and likely their payroll, payroll process, or payroll leads name and email address, all from doing internet research, right? And so you could see how easy it is for someone to pretend to be your employee, know where you work, and submit documents via email requesting changes. So I would not be surprised, Melissa, if we see this even more in the future.
Both Sarah and Stacy said in the chat they've also received those emails too.
Oh, gosh.
Right now.
Yeah, that's a lot of money lost, So I'm not glad to hear that this has occurred to any of your practices, but it does help reinforce the seriousness of these actions and the activity that's occurring. They seem to have no boundaries, right, in the ways that they can be creative to hack accounts and to steal people's identity. And even then, like, if you think about it, they kind of really didn't even directly steal the identity. We just didn't notice that something didn't match up, like didn't hover over the name to see the real email address, or didn't ask enough questions, so some of them are fun because you can overtly tell by the language that they use. You go, Sarah would never say something like that, or would never use that word combination, right? Like sometimes there's things where you go, but sometimes they're not. They're really professional and crafty, and they get away with it. That's why they do it. Adulteration and falsification. So checking for invoices, that were printed out of training versions, because that doesn't just happen with cash receipts. This also happens with creating medical records and vaccine records for patients that have never been to your clinic. And I will tell you, this actually happened to me, and it wasn't in the training version. This goes along with the second point and the third point. Run an audit trail to check for altered charges and documents, and deleted patients, deleted clients. Limit access to the deletion of invoices, clients, estimates, things such as that. Here's the reason why. Because I told you I spend the first 10 minutes of every day just doing kind of a look back for the day prior, just for anything that I need to address, and just making sure everything reconciles and looks good. But I also do that because our doctors are production, and I also want to make sure that they're getting credit for the services that they've provided, and it's not under the incorrect employee. So I don't just do that because I'm paranoid and I want to act as if everyone's a thief. It's part of just my routine best practices. But the employee I had let go the day before must have had a sneaking suspicion they were going to be let go that day, because I noticed that morning, and I had let the employee go at the end of the day, not for this reason. I just happened to find this the next day. It's all done. But the employee had created a pet on her account that I had never heard of, we had never seen, put in services so that it updated and triggered reminders, and created an actual medical record and printed it out, I guess, to take with her, and then deleted the whole thing. So now she's got a medical record that this dog is up to date on all vaccines and services, and we've never even seen the pet before. So very interesting. Again, you learned from my story earlier how important it is to verify employee initials, codes, stamps that contradict who was scheduled or clocked in for that day and time. Securing employee accounts so they don't have the ability to add, change, or remove patients' charges and payments. We talked about that already. Adulteration, people actually tamper with products too. Whoa, who'd have thought? Sometimes disgruntled employees do things to sabotage. So things like having thermometers, that's just good practice on the quality control of your products, but it also ensures that if someone is tampering or sabotaging, that you can be ahead of the curve on that. So thermometers on the fridges. Also, again, we talked about injectables. It's good to have those in an area of surveillance because I have heard of clinics where an employee was drawing out medication, but backfilling the vial with either saline or water or some other substitute. And I've heard a horror story where patients have awakened during anesthesia because the drugs had been tampered with. And so they were drawing out the right dosage, but it wasn't having the same effect because it had been tampered with. Staff samples, putting them into inventory and then dispensing them at the no charge, maybe, where there's a record and a label that's generated that product's been dispensed. That also helps ensure it goes to the right pet and the right category, right species and weight category. But if you are just adamant against doing that, maybe some other way of indicating the product is not for resale. So like sample not for resale labeled on it. Because I've also heard a story where product was missing, a large amount of product was missing, and it was found on eBay in their area. So I could see where samples, I mean, I think we've all even, if you really looked some of your different social groups, like resale groups, I've seen products like flea and tick products being sold to, people in the area. So I like to believe that that's someone's, like that they've purchased it and they no longer have that pet and are just trying to get their money back. And someone else can use it. But then again, how many times have you read that and thought, oh, is that someone's employee? All right. One of the ways that you can minimize employees from making changes and adding things to their own account. This one is a snapshot of Avamark. For those of you who are Cornerstone or any of the other PIM systems out there, Impromed and so forth, you can ask if they have anything similar to this. I believe Impromed does, but I'm not sure about Cornerstone, and y'all can chime in if you know for sure it does. But here in the employee setup, there's this box here that tends to go neglected. It's called the client account access. You can actually, so this is just FYI, this is not a real employee. This is actually just out of Avamark's training manual. So I promise you, I'm not giving away anyone's personal information. But you can drop down here and start typing in the employee's account number. So I would find David Sharp's account number, put in his account number here, and you can drop it down to where they can have full access or they can have limited access. So this is the exact excerpt from this Avamark's training. Like for instance, add history gives them the access to add, change, or remove medical history. Full access gives them full access. Read only allows them to, or view only allows them to only read what's in their patient account, their own pets, but does not allow them to make changes. I will tell you, me personally, I did not allow any of the employees to have access to their own account for adding or removing anything. It was all read only. So if they had services provided, just like any client would, the staff members associated with executing those services other than them would put in those services, and then I would review them, or they would come to me. Or if something was put on their account accidentally or wasn't discounted correctly, they would come to me. They weren't allowed to add or remove from their own account. So that's a kind of a good tip if anybody's interested in that. All right, so a few other just best practices and some other key takeaways that don't necessarily fall into any of the various categories, but I think it's important to talk about. But preventative measures can include background checks as long as you're observing applicable laws about how, when, and under what guidelines you can do those. So I am not saying run out tomorrow and just start doing background checks. I'm saying know your law first. Provide anti-fraud training to all staff on how to identify signs of theft or embezzlement. And that'll be a whole nother training topic. Although if we have time at the end, we can all, I think that would be a great discussion for recognizing signs or what to do. Providing employees with a method for anonymous reporting of theft, fraud, and adulteration. Ensuring that upon separation, employee discount codes are removed. And well, to be honest with you, their permission settings are removed from any systems. Like that, I hope, is like the #1 thing that you're doing. Upon hiring a new employee, collect the names of their pets that they own so that claims of additional pets are mitigated. And to be honest with you, I go back and kind of take it a step further in the interview process. Like we like to talk about animals. I'll ask them about, their pets and, and so forth. And it's a good icebreaker anyway. And so then you don't have to worry about being offered a job and then all of a sudden like cousins, aunts, and uncles become their pets during the new hire setup process. Setting up appropriate security controls in your practice management software, and making sure that you're doing regular search functions to make sure, or searches to make sure that employees aren't functioning particular activities or actions or system processes that are not relevant to their role. And then consider setting alone in clinic or outside of business hours limitations or restrictions. And this is also a good safety tip too, because I've also seen where I've had employees coming into the clinic after hours and I was not aware that they were going in or the reason why they were there. The good news is the couple of circumstances that has happened to me upon watching surveillance, there was nothing, fraudulent going on. There was, a valid reason for them being there. But again, for both safety and from a preventative standpoint, having some type of policy or limits or restrictions on that. All right, so we have come to the end of my presentation. And so I think this is a great time. If any of you have any questions, anything that I can answer for you or need me to elaborate more on, or of course, if there's anything that you want to share, I'd love to hear it. So I'm going to take it out of presentation. I'm going to stop sharing so I can get to the chat feature and see those. And we can open up, of course, unmute if you'd like to open up and join in the discussion. All right. So we ran a couple of minutes over, but we started a little bit late. So for those of you who have to jump,
the time we started with the time we ended is exactly.
So perfect. So if anyone wants to stay on, and I'll stay on for another 5 or 10 minutes, if anyone has any questions or just needs kind of a one-on-one situation talked through or best practice, by all means.
One thing that I've had almost all of those situations affect me. Hopefully you can hear me. Dee texted me that my microphone is off because it wasn't hooked up correctly, but hopefully you can hear me now. One thing I wanted to kind of ask would you recommend that people are taking credit cards over the phone at all? Or would you just say don't? Because that costs the hospital more money when you manually punch it in anyway. So
absolutely. I know that during high COVID, we had to be creative, and our system, we weren't fast enough, right, to pivot, and there weren't a ton of resources or affordable resources for collecting payments. So I know that there were some drastic measures there for taking credit card payment. However, there are so many different applications and ways for collecting payment without having to verbalize it now. We have text to pay, and cloud-based terminals now. So if you're not doing that, I would recommend researching and looking into that versus writing down and keying in, because you are correct, Melissa.
You're paying
Those
more.
come at a higher rate. You kind
Yeah,
of
a lot of
don't
people didn't
eat.
realize that. And then after the first few months of COVID, they're like, oh my God, my merchant services bill went skyrocketing. I'm like, yeah, it's because you manually punched in all those cards. So I was just
Absolutely.
curious.
I saw upwards
Yeah.
of 1% and 2% increase in merchant services during COVID, like bottom line impact for some hospitals for the amount of keyed entries they were doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have anything to ask Jess? There's a lot of good information. It is eye-opening. I know, I think Christina said that in her message it is eye-opening to know. And it happens, almost every one of those I've dealt with in some form. So it's not like it's random. It's going to happen. It could happen to you tomorrow, or it has happened to you, you don't even know it. So do all the double checks, right?
And so all of you have access to, it'll be recorded, so you'll have access to the recording to re-review. But Melissa, I'll also download those slides and send them directly to you. So for those of you who like to print things out and kind of keep it in a reference binder, you'll be able to do that as well, or just save it electronically for future reference. I'll send that over as well.
Perfect. I'll send it over when I send them the link.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all for attending, and I look forward to seeing you all on the next discussion. I think the next one for me, keep an eye out on DVM 360. I'll be doing a podcast. So I'm really excited about that one. That one will be doing some skills stacking. And then June, we'll be talking about some creative strategies for hooking some new grads and experienced associates. So that one will be C's Get Degrees with June 1st, a VHMA. So keep an eye out.
Excellent. Excellent. So
All right.
Jess, there's lots of fun messages for you in the chat. You should take a look before I close the meeting.
Wonderful, wonderful. I look forward to catching up on all the chat that was going on. All right. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Bye, guys.
Oh, some of these, like, it breaks my heart hearing, stealing, time clock, fraud, toilet paper. Oh, food.
I forgot about it. I had that happen to my husband too. Before 2020, this was like in 2017.
White out. Oh my gosh. Let's see. Yeah, theft of health insurance. That one is becoming more and more common too. Yeah. Yes, Joan brought up a good one, being a part of a corporate group. Sometimes their accesses to certain reporting and audits they're not able to do. I would have a conversation with their supervisor to see how they can gain